Well, welcome. Welcome to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. In today's table topic, we're talking about the Supreme Court's redistricting decision, and we're explaining it. Because if you didn't know any better, and you spend all of your time scrolling through the outrage on social media, you might be tempted to think that we are moving back in time. You think the foundations are cracking. But if you look a little closer, if you really examine the heart of the law, you'll see that we aren't retreating. We are simply righting our wrongs once and for all. You know, sometimes America is great at creating a solution. We're even better at finding a solution to a problem that doesn't even exist. What happens when it stops supporting and it starts sabotaging? Usually, we just ignore it. We get comfortable. We begin to live with our dysfunction rather than doing the hard work to get rid of it. But look, I get it. Believe me, I really, really get it. Because as a millennial, I know our generation is tired of the back and forth. And as a minority, I know that nobody wants to be the one that stands up and says, this isn't working anymore and has to go. It's uncomfortable. It's controversial. It'll get you canceled in certain circles. But you know what hurts more than a difficult conversation is the amount of tax dollars that is being spent and the sheer amount of human potential lost because we refuse to remove what is no longer serving us. Because ignorance is expensive and it's time consuming, and we are being held back by blueprints that don't fit the house that we're actually trying to build. Well, today we're going to talk about a decision that finally stopped the sabotage. We're breaking down the Supreme Court's ruling on the Louisiana redistricting and why this is a massive win for every American who believes in being seen as an individual and not as a data point. But in order to understand what is happening today, we have to discuss why this is such a controversial topic and where it started. So let's lay the groundwork. On April 29th, the Supreme Court handed down a 6-3 decision in Louisiana versus Calais. After the 2020 census, a huge legal battle broke out. A lower court originally told Louisiana, hey guys, 1/3 of the population is Black, but only one out of the 6 districts is majority Black. So you need to draw a second district to comply with the Voting Rights Act. So that's what was told after the 2020 census. So Louisiana did just that. They drew a second majority minority district that snaked across the state to connect specific communities. But then a group of voters sued, saying, wait a minute. You didn't draw this based on geography or shared community interests. You drew this based off of purely skin color. Well, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed. Justice Alito wrote for the majority, and it was very firm. And he essentially said that the Constitution almost never allows the government to discriminate based on race, even if they claim they're doing it to help or to comply with old laws. The court ruled that Louisiana's 2nd District was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. And to understand why this is a win and not a loss, you have to understand the two very different ways people are looking at redistricting, particularly when it comes to these minority heavy districts. So you have the first perspective, which is what we've been living with for decades. It's the idea that the only way for a minority community to have a voice or a vote is to be clustered together into one specific district, what they call a majority minority district. The argument here is that without these lines, the minority voters will always be drowned out. And what they're doing is they're treating us all like a monolith, assuming that because we all look the same, then we all must think the same. And then that means that we all want the same things. It's a solution born in 1965 that essentially says representation is a numbers game played with race. But then there's perspective two. The second perspective says that which is the one that I believe is more respectful to who we are as individuals. This perspective says that when you draw lines based on race to meet a quota, you aren't empowering people, you're pigeonholing them. You're telling candidates you only have to care about these section of voters if they're in a specific bubble. This is why you typically don't see Democrats campaigning in Republican districts or Republicans campaigning in Democrat districts during primaries. Because what's the point? It's already been designed to work against. The perspective argues that the Constitution's promise of equal protection doesn't mean equal results through social engineering. It means that the government shouldn't be looking at your skin color when it decides where you vote. And for a long time, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act had been used as a mandate to create these racial bubbles. But what the court just signaled is that the era of race prominent map making is hitting a dead end. So to understand why the Louisiana decision is such a pivot point, we have to look back at the law that started it all, and that was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 1965, the law was an absolute necessity. We were living in an era where there were literacy tests, there were poll tax, there was physical intimidation that was used to systemically keep minority voters away from the ballot box. This was happening. Overall, the Voting Rights Act did two major things. It outlawed the literacy tests and those good moral character requirements that were designed to fail anyone who had the wrong skin color. Grateful for that. Under Section 5, states with a history of discrimination couldn't even move a polling place across the street without getting preclearance from the Department of Justice in D.C. Good. So overall, it was a heavy-handed federal intervention. And at the time, it worked. At the time, it was necessary. But within just 2 years, minority registration in the South skyrocketed, and we should celebrate that victory. We should celebrate that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 worked in 1965 and a few years after. But then there's Section 2. And unlike the other parts that were temporary of the act, Section 2 is permanent. It's the tool used to challenge any voting practice that results in a denial or a abridgment of the right to vote. For decades, this was interpreted to mean that if I am in a minority group and I didn't have a certain number of safe elected seats, the system was discriminatory. Here is where we have to be honest. What was meant to be a shield against exclusion has turned into a tool of engineering. So after the break, we're going to dive into exactly how Justice Alito and the majority are shifting the burden of proof back to where it belongs. We're going to talk about why Section 2 is a crown jewel of the Civil Rights Act and is being reevaluated for the modern America, and why sticking to a 60-year-old fix that has already fixed a problem that existed back then might actually be the very thing sabotaging our political potential today. I really feel passionate about this. I really believe that we are going to open ourselves up to a new era. I think we're going to see people who were traditionally lumped into these predominantly Black districts. I believe we're going to see these same people now be redrawn into districts that are more balanced, where the leadership doesn't look like you from the top to the bottom, from the Ruta to the Tuta, so that we're not, having all Black council, all Black commission, all Black school board, and then wondering why things are not working out in our communities. Now you're going to get a different type of representation. You're going to be a part of the conversation. It's now time to do it right. And we're going to dig into all of this. I'm going to provide a lot of details. Then I'm going to close the show with specific data points and facts that prove that we no longer need this part of the Civil Rights Act. That we've done it. We've overcome it, and we're good. So stick around. We're just getting started. You're listening to The Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. Don't leave the table.
The left is siding with illegals, attacking ICE, and fighting to let non-citizens vote. Republican Kelvin King is a graduate of the Air Force Academy, Air Force veteran, and conservative businessman. As Georgia's Secretary of State, Kelvin will put Americans first, root out corruption, clean up voter rolls, and restore confidence in our elections. The other candidates had their chance and failed. Republican Kelvin King for Secretary of State. Leadership Georgia voters can trust.
Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3, and this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. In today's table topic, we're talking about the Supreme Court's redistricting decision, and we're explaining it. So before the break, I laid out the history, the rescue mission of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We acknowledged that while the law was a vital response to a systemic exclusion of the past, we have to ask ourselves if the tool of 1965 is now becoming shackles of 2026. So now I want to get into the why. Why is the Supreme Court stepping in now, and what does this mean for our future? Well, to understand the Louisiana case, you have to understand Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And while other parts of the law are temporary, the Section 2 of the Act is permanent. And it prohibits any voting practice that results in a denial of the right to vote based on race. So over the years, this has been used to create these majority-minority districts. The logic was if you don't group minority voters together in one high concentrated bubble, that they won't have a chance to elect their candidate of choice. That in order for us to get the candidate that we want, we all have to be in the same district. And for decades, the courts used what they call the Gingell's test. Essentially, it's a math equation that forced states to prioritize race when drawing lines to ensure that these are what they call safe seats and that they exist. So that brings us to the recent 6-3 decision in Louisiana versus the Calais, if I'm saying that wrong, forgive me, it's spelled Callais. And you have Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote the majority opinion, joined by Justice Thomas, Roberts, Gosher, and Kavanaugh and Barrett. The court was firm. The Louisiana map that was provided was unconstitutional racial gerrymander. Justice Alito's core argument was that allowing race to play any part in government decision-making is a direct departure from the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So think about that. The Constitution was designed to protect the individual, not the group. By striking this down, the court made 3 key points. They stated that race cannot be the predominant factor. You can't start a map by looking at skin color and work backwards. It's no longer enough to just show that the numbers don't look diverse enough. You have to prove that there was actual intentional discrimination. And his third point was that the government shouldn't be in the business of trying to balance the electorate like a chemistry experiment. But there's a bigger issue at play. If a state tries to pass a law that says you can't vote because of your skin, the color of your skin, then yeah, Section 2 is the hammer that stops them. That's the part of the act that hasn't changed. It's still illegal to discriminate. It's still illegal to deny access. The issue in Louisiana wasn't about denying anyone the right to vote, it was about racial engineering. So, what is racial engineering? Racial engineering is the deliberate process of using census data and sophisticated software to group voters into specific districts based primarily on their skin color to achieve a predetermined political outcome. And you got to ask yourself, okay, well, how does this really affect the political outcome? Because we don't know how people vote. Well, statistically, we know that predominantly in the Black community, they vote Democrat. Statistically. So if you put a lot of Black people in one area, you kind of make a Democrat district. So map makers look at heat maps of racial demographics and draw lines, often snaking them through narrow corridors or jumping across water to ensure that the district reaches a specific percentage of a certain minority group, which is usually 50% or higher. This is often done to comply with a specific interpretation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which for years has been used to argue that a minority group can be drawn into a majority minority district, and the state must do it. They made it a mandate. I remember talking about this on the Georgia Gang when I was on the show, and I was thinking, this is absurd. And I remember I had a panelist, Melita, who made the comment where she's like, "Oh, well, you're a Black person from Connecticut, so." And I'm like, what? Like, these people really believe that this is something that's honorable. But it's so discriminatory. And it's so not right. The fundamental difference lies in the distinction between equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Because opportunity is ensuring that every citizen, regardless of race, has an equal path to the ballot box and can vote for whoever they choose to vote for. And this is important because I remember when I lived in East Point, I was in a predominantly Black district, one of these districts. And I just remember there being no Republicans to vote for. Everyone ran as a Democrat. And I had to do my best to try to decipher between which of these Democrats make more sense or could at least align a little bit with what I believed. That happened for me personally because I was forced into one of these engineered districts. Because engineering is attempting to guarantee that a specific racial group is able to elect the candidate of their choice, which it should be able to elect the candidate of their party, and ensure that that person makes it through a general election and that they get the seat. It's not about just being able to elect them. It's about ensuring that they win the seat by concentrating them into a single district. This process assumes a monolithic voting block, and it operates on the premise that all minority voters think exactly alike and will only be represented if we are placed in a district with people who look like us. Because engineering often results in two phenomena. The impact of political power results in two things: packing and cracking. Packing involves cramming as many minority voters as possible into one or two safe districts. While this virtually guarantees a minority preferred candidate wins that specific seat, it wastes those votes of the rest of the state. It removes those voters from neighboring districts, meaning the representatives in those other areas no longer have a political incentive to listen to or compete for minority interests. Then there's cracking, which is the opposite side of the coin. It's where a community is split up so thin that they have no influence. Critics of racial engineering argue that the government's attempt to fix representation through these methods actually leads to segregation by another name. By drawing lines around people based on race, the government is essentially sorting the citizenry, which the Supreme Court has recently signaled in its departure from the Equal Protection Clause. The court's stance is that once the government starts engineering maps based on race, it is no longer colorblind. It is now violating the core principle that every citizen should be treated as an individual and not as a demographic statistic. And for years, activists have used Section 2 as a shortcut. They would look at a map and say, okay, wait, 30% of this state is black, but only 15% of the district is majority black. Therefore, you must draw another majority black district, and they turned a law about opportunity into a law about quotas. And in the Louisiana decision, the ruling does not impact the core protection against actual discrimination. If there is intentional racism, if a map is drawn specifically to hurt a minority group, Section 2 still strikes it down. But what the court changed is the numbers game. They said that you can't just point to a lack of proportional districts and scream racism. Judge Alito made it very clear. To win the Section 2 case from now on, you have to show that the lack of opportunity is actually because of race and not because of partisanship. Because in 2026, we have a primarily two-party system. And just because a group of voters doesn't get their preferred candidate doesn't mean that they were discriminated against. It might just mean that their ideas didn't win the majority, which is the way it's supposed to be, which is normal. And to me, that sounds extremely reasonable and it's very logical. But unfortunately, logic doesn't always satisfy the emotional connection to a subject, and particularly when it comes to this topic, it's no different. The critics are loud. They say this weakens minority representation. They say that without these protective bubbles, we lose our voice as Black people. Now, I'm here to say the opposite, because packing minorities in a specific district is its own form of marginalization. It treats us like a predictable, robotic voting bloc rather than individual thinkers with diverse interests and perspectives and political views. And when you pack us into one district, you are effectively telling the representatives in the other districts that they don't need to earn our vote, that our vote is already guaranteed to go in one direction. There's so many people who live in these districts. I've talked to them. There are Black conservatives and Black Republicans who live in these predominantly Black districts that are run and overrun by predominantly Democrat leaders. And every time a Black Republican tries to raise their hand or tries to do something, they end up getting shot down. Look at Misha Maynard. When she decided to speak out and she became a Republican here in Georgia and she flipped parties, she couldn't even win her district because it was so heavily Democrat and is predominantly Black. It was one of these types of districts. So when you do stuff like this, those who are supposed to represent all of us ignore these districts that represent a portion of us. So that means that they can ignore our concerns about inflation. They can ignore our concerns about school choice or safety, because those people are already accounted for in the safe seat. So overall, there is a massive empowerment in being seen as a voter first rather than a demographic statistic. Colorblind maps force a change in behavior. They encourage candidates to actually compete for minority votes in every single district. It stops the political parties from taking us for granted. And when a Republican or a Democrat has to look at a diverse district and realize that they can't win without speaking to everyone, we gain leverage. We move from being a safe number on a spreadsheet to being a swing vote that decides an election. We move from being the voter that is pandered to when you have elected officials saying things like, I carry hot sauce. Yeah. Can't do all of that because now the district is a mixed bag. It's not predominantly black anymore. But I'm going to come back to that topic in the last segment of the show because I'm going to explain to you exact reasons why the justice's decision was absolutely correct. But continuing on, by insisting on these majority-minority bubbles, we are telling the government that we are too weak to compete on a level playing field. We were allowing them to treat us like a protected species instead of equal citizens. And the decision doesn't touch the portion of the act that protects rights to cast a ballot. It only touches the part that allows politicians to use skin color as a tool to draw lines for their own benefit. Speaking of benefits, there is a benefit to the Republican Party. So this ruling paves a way for a more diverse Republican Party. For too long, we've been told that minority voters and conservative values are at odds. Or we've been told that even though minorities are more conservative, they vote against their interests. But when you remove the racial engineering, we win on ideas. We win on opportunity because that's what a lot of black voters want. We win on safety because that is an issue and a topic that is very prominent in the black community. And we win on family because the family, the dismantling of family is the one thing that has harmed the black community. So putting some of these values back into our districts, or at least allowing them to hear of these values, because oftentimes these districts, they gatekeep and they block out anyone who wants to vote against their interests, the party's interests. So our party, the Republican Party, doesn't need to engineer a map to win minority hearts. We just need to show that our policies work better for the individual than the identity politics of the left. This decision doesn't move us backwards. It levels the playing field so that we can have all the best ideas in the forefront and that we can finally win on ideas and not skin color. But I know some of you are still thinking, but we need these protections to keep things fair. There's this warped understanding that policy is what is somehow holding back discrimination, and that we are willing to discriminate in other areas if it means maintaining these so-called protections. But the truth is, in 2026, we aren't fighting literacy tests. We are fighting the idea that our communities are so fragile that we need the federal government to draw special circles around us just so that we can have a seat at the table. That's the new fight. That's the new argument now. And it's absurd. We're not there. We're not in 1965 anymore. We are in 2026. And we have so much that we can look at, so many points that we can point to that can now justify why we no longer need these protections and how these protections have turned into a saboteur. So I went to a event where they were talking about the difference between saboteur, like they were talking about saboteurs. It was like this new personality thing that they were doing for businesses. And they were saying how oftentimes we create things to help us survive. And these are great survival mechanisms at one point in our lives. But then when we no longer need it, they become saboteurs. They begin to sabotage your life. So, for instance, if you're someone who needed to be socially rejected, or like you were socially ejected outside of communities and outside of relationships because of the fact that, you were raised in households where that was safe. It was safe to not be in the mix. It was safe to kind of have your own space. And then you grow up and now you're working in an office and you're realizing that this wall that I put up that was supposed to be a protection is now becoming a saboteur. It's now sabotaging me. That's kind of what's happening here. So that the very thing that's supposed to protect you is now has now lumped everyone into these little spaces, these pockets of these states, and the only representation you are even shown are those who represent the majority of what the district looks like. If you're a white Republican trying to run in a predominantly Democrat area, your chances are out. Even if you're a black Republican, it's now turned into a partisan thing based on race. And that's a problem. So when we come back, I'm going to provide the hard truths, the reasons why Black Americans are no longer in need of these specific protections, and why clinging to them is actually hurting our community's growth and our political power as a whole. We're almost done. You're listening to The Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. Don't leave the table.
Kelvin King is uniquely qualified to serve as Georgia's next Secretary of State. He'll restore trust, abolish secretive QR codes on ballots, and end no-bid contracts, enriching insiders. Both of King's opponents, former office COO Gabriel Sterling and Representative Tim Fleming, refused to end QR codes or end the dirty no-bid contracts. The Inspector General found Sterling violated Georgia's Code of Ethics, but Fleming did nothing. Elect Republican Kelvin King. Let's restore trust.
Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King. This is Extra 106.3, and this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. In today's table topic, we're talking about the Supreme Court's redistricting decision. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've broke down the Supreme Court's decision, the 6-3 decision in the Louisiana versus the Calais, and why Justice Alito, who spoke for the majority who voted to bring this down, why they were right to call out the racial engineering and what that is. It's a departure from the Equal Protection Clause. They were able to disentangle the myth that Section 2 of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is being killed and clarified that while the right to vote remains sacred, the government's permission to sort us like cattle into these safe, quote unquote, districts has finally been revoked. So before I close the show, if you're joining us for the first time and you want to share in this conversation, you can find the full video on our YouTube channel. Just search The Janelle King Show. You can also catch an encore right here on Extra 106.3 on Sunday at 9 a.m. or listen to the podcast that drops every single Tuesday right here on Extra's Podcast Park or wherever you get your podcasts. But I want to leave you with something that's a bit heavy, but that's not abnormal to this show and to my kitchen table debaters, because you got to be able to have these heavy conversations. That's what I'm talking about when I say these are conversations that are banned from family gatherings. No one wants to have this conversation, but it's absolutely necessary we have it in order to have a strong republic. So let's talk about it. The left is telling you that without these racial protections, Black Americans, that we are at risk of losing our place in society. But for some reason, the data tells us a completely different story. Because we are told that we need protection because we are a vulnerable monolith, but the facts say otherwise. And here are some points that I believe that are just a few, not all, that will explain why this is no longer necessary. First, we are flourishing financially as Black Americans. I don't care what anybody has to say. The data reflects it. If you are so oppressed by the lack of racial gerrymandering, then how do you explain the explosion of Black wealth? Because according to the HSBC and the Federal Reserve, there are now roughly 1.8 to 2 million Black American millionaires in the United States. 4 million of our ancestors were freed from slavery during the emancipation. And here we are today with half of the Blacks in this country, half of that 4 million. I know we've multiplied cents, I get that. But just for perspective purposes, if you were to take the 4 million who were freed during emancipation, cut that in half of them are now millionaires. That's what it would be like. That's interesting, right? We aren't a community of victims waiting for a map to save us. We are a community of entrepreneurs, high earners, who are thriving in merit-based economies. This isn't just celebrity wealth, because according to the U.S. Census Bureau data on business owners, there has been a 43% surge in Black-owned businesses over the last several years. These are the engines of our communities. These are dry cleaners, they're tech startups, they're logistic firms. They're owned by people who didn't wait for a protected district to build an empire. They succeeded because they provided value in a competitive market. So yeah, growth is happening. And then there's a direct correlation between the success stories in our community and the presence of a stable two-parent household. Because while the nation's conversation often focuses on instability, the data shows that a significant success gap exists. According to research popularized by the Institute of Family Studies, Black men who are in stable first marriages are significantly more likely to reach the middle class or higher compared to those who are not. This is what the data shows. We're going to come back to that point because that point ties directly into my last point. But continuing on, we also have to look at the landscape of American leadership today. We are no longer represented by a handful of civil rights leaders from a single era. We have Black men and women serving as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. We have Black U.S. senators, Black governors who won in these majority white states. Majority of the Black leaders that are in Washington right now comes from majority white districts. Look at Wesley Hunt. Look at Byron Donalds. According to the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, the number of Black elected officials have grown by over 5,000% since the 1960s. And the most telling part is that many of these leaders are winning in these unprotected districts. They aren't winning because of racial quotas. They're winning because they have a message for the voters. Look at Jasmine Crockett. She just lost to a white guy in a predominantly Democrat Black district. Yeah. Because when you combine this level of business ownership with the growing number of families prioritizing traditional structures, you see a community that is outgrowing the need for these training wheels of a law. Here's another reason why we do not need this portion of the law. And that's because political diversity is exploding. And the idea that we must be packed into one district to have a voice assumes that we all think the same. But let's look at the shift in the GOP. Between 2016 and 2020, and into the most recent election cycles, so from 2016 to present, we have now seen Black support for the Republican platform significantly grow. And some may say that it was specifically support for Donald Trump. But the increase went from 12%, which was already an increase from where we were, to 16%, according to the Associated Press Votecast and Pew Research. So right now, 16% of the Black community, the Black electorate, supports the Republican Party. You know why? Because we're thinking for ourselves now. And because we're moving towards a party that wins on ideas like family, safety, and opportunity rather than identity. And third, there's just a geographical reality that Black Americans make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. But we are no longer confined to the same neighborhoods our grandparents were. We're scattered across the suburbs, we're in tech hubs, we're in rural communities. And when a law tries to bubble us into one district, it ignores our physical and social mobility. You get districts like what Louisiana was trying to do. It's hard now to create these districts because we're so scattered. We're living throughout the states. We don't need a district drawn for us. We need candidates who can win us over wherever we live. And my last point, in respecting of time, because we definitely can continue on, is that we need to address the actual deficits in our community. We have to stop blaming the maps, blaming the white man, and blaming all the external factors for the problems in our own homes. The great Thomas Sowell, the great economist, documented extensively throughout his career, and most notably in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, he lists the deficits and why we see these disparities in these communities, particularly when it comes to Black people and Black communities. And he found that there were three main factors that contribute to the detriment of our community. The first being repeated patterns of problematic behavior, family instability, and a shift in cultural priorities. These are the true hurdles in our community. And when 70% of our children are born in single-parent households, that isn't a redistricting problem. It's a culture problem. And when we prioritize grievance over grit, no Supreme Court ruling can fix that. And when we place sports over books, we are setting ourselves up for failure. Because the protections of 1965 were for a community that was being locked out. In 2026, the only thing locking us out is the belief that we aren't good enough to compete without a handicap. We are millionaires. We are independent thinkers. We are equal citizens. We are contributing factors in society, and our voice matters, our voice counts. And we've got to start demanding that people who want to run for office talk to us like people, not like a voting block. We have to stop with the cliches and all the funny sayings and the one-liners and the hoopla and all the extra stuff and the entertainment and the music and the food we got to stop with all of that. Protecting our republic is not about making you feel comfortable. It's not about making you feel excited or fun. It's a sacrifice. It's about doing the hard work. It's about doing your research, figuring out who is running to represent you, and not demanding that they look like you, because that's absurd. It's insane. It's time that we start acting like the powerful force that we are as citizens in this country. Until next time, stay unafraid, stay unapologetic, and never stop seeking the truth.